for was a prank too. And as Jasper belly-flopped into the ocean from the top of the lighthouse, the villagers thought maybe they were the ones who took a prank a little too far. Gah! Ghost Friend. Rusty and Gabe were best friends from the time they were little. They hung out at Rusty's house every day after school, and on weekends they'd watch their favorite soccer team play on TV. Goal! Most of the time, Rusty and Gabe got along great. But every once in a while, Gabe did something that annoyed Rusty. But Rusty knew that even best friends can sometimes get on each other's nerves. Then one day something terrible happened to Gabe, and I don't want to get into the details because it's way too sad for a kid's book. Later on that year, Rusty was really sad because he missed his best friend. And even though Gabe did a lot of annoying things, Rusty knew he would do anything to spend just one more afternoon with his pal. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew into Rusty's room, and when he turned around, there was his best friend Gabe. Right now you are probably saying, "Oh, I guess Gabe wasn't dead after all." But you're wrong, because this was the ghost version of Gabe. Gabe said he had come back from the spirit world because he knew Rusty really needed him. And that kind of made Rusty feel bad for thinking about all the times Gabe annoyed him. But Gabe said now that he was a ghost, he wouldn't have to go home, and they could hang out all night if they wanted. Well, Rusty was glad to have his friend back, but the thing about staying up late made him a little nervous, because this was a school night, and he liked to get to bed early. But Rusty didn't say anything, because he knew Gabe would tell him he was being a goody-two-shoes. Rusty said he should probably go downstairs and tell his parents that Gabe was back, but Gabe said that would spoil their fun, and they should keep this ghost thing a secret. Gabe said they should just hang out and play video games like they did in the old days. But when Rusty handed Gabe a controller, it went right through his hands. It turned out since Gabe was a ghost, he couldn't touch anything. So he had Rusty play the game for him, which wasn't really that much fun for Rusty. X, Y, A, B, down arrow. Down arrow, you dummy! After a few hours, Rusty said he needed to do his homework. Gabe said he was glad he didn't have to do homework anymore since he was dead. And he kept talking, which made it really hard for Rusty to concentrate. Finally, Rusty put a soccer game on TV so Gabe would stop bugging him for a while. But Gabe booed the whole time, and Rusty couldn't tell if that was because Gabe didn't like one of the teams, or if he was just making ghost noises. Boo! After a while, Gabe got bored with the game and he started trying out his ghost powers, like walking through walls. Yo, check this out! And that made it even harder for Rusty to concentrate on his homework. Rusty gave up on his homework and told Gabe he needed to go to sleep. But Gabe said that was kind of inconvenient for him because ghosts don't sleep. Rusty got ready for bed and hoped Gabe would just float away to wherever it is that ghosts go at night. But even after Rusty got under the covers and turned off the lights, Gabe kept hanging around, talking. And all Gabe wanted to do was talk about this girl named Kelsey Reed who he had a crush on. Somehow Rusty fell asleep, and when he woke up, Gabe was still talking. And he kept right on talking while Rusty got ready for school. Rusty told Gabe he'd catch up with him when he got back from school. But Gabe said it would be too boring to wait in Rusty's bedroom all day, so he was coming with him. It turns out Rusty was the only one who could see or hear Gabe, and he talked the whole way to school. But Rusty didn't really respond, because he didn't want anyone thinking he was talking to himself. First period for Rusty was science. And unfortunately, Marcus Meeks was absent, so that meant there was an empty seat right behind Rusty, where Gabe sat down and distracted Rusty all through class, whispering things like, "Boring." The next period was Spanish, and there was a pop quiz. Rusty didn't get a chance to look over his notes the night before, so he knew he was in trouble. But this was where having a ghost friend came in handy for Rusty, because Gabe whispered all the answers. lagartija, pera, patata. Rusty's teacher graded the quizzes during class, and when Rusty got his quiz back, he remembered that Gabe had always been lousy in Spanish. He got an F. At recess, Rusty was too tired to play kickball with the other kids, so he sat on the bench. Then Kelsey Reed sat down next to him. Kelsey started talking to Rusty, and she was really nice. But when Rusty tried to talk, he could barely think because Gabe was being really annoying. Ask if she'd date a ghost. Ask! Ask! On the walk home, all Gabe could talk about was Kelsey Reed. Do you think she noticed me? I think she noticed me. And this time, Rusty didn't even bother responding. That night, Rusty needed to study for a test, but of course Gabe made that impossible by poking his head through the desk and yelling, "Boo! Gah!" By now, Rusty was overtired and cranky, and finally he just snapped. Rusty blamed Gabe for his bad grade in Spanish, and said his constant talking was driving him nuts. And he said maybe it would have been better if Gabe hadn't come back in the first place. But as soon as the words left Rusty's mouth, he wished he could take them back because he could tell he'd hurt his friend's feelings. Gabe said that if Rusty felt that way, then maybe he should just go back to the spirit world. But that kind of got Rusty a little teary-eyed because he knew if Gabe was gone for good, he'd probably start missing him again. Rusty said he was sorry and that he didn't want Gabe to go to the spirit world. So Gabe stuck around, and it wasn't for a little while either. Rusty's grades went downhill, and he didn't bother going to college because he knew he'd never get any work done with Gabe in the picture. Plus, he never got a girlfriend because he knew Gabe would probably mess that up too. And even though Rusty thought it was nice to have his best friend around, sometimes he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. Boo! The Biter. Once there was a girl named Lily, and from the time she was a baby, Lily liked putting things in her mouth. Right now you're probably saying, all babies like putting things in their mouths. But trust me, this kid was different. It wasn't just baby toys, it was everything. So Lily's parents had to get used to their stuff being covered in baby drool all the time. Lily's pediatrician told her parents their baby was teething, and that's why she always needed something to chew on. So Lily's parents just tried to ignore her and let Lily do her thing. But then Lily's teeth started coming in, and they were sharp, especially when she was nipping at their ankles. Youch! Lily's parents kept hoping she'd grow out of this stage, but she never did. When Lily got a little older, her parents tried to set up playdates with other kids, but they always ended in tears. Lily's parents bought a bunch of books to help teach their daughter that biting was bad, but the lesson never seemed to sink in. Plus, books were some of Lily's favorite things to chew on. She got special pleasure out of gnawing the book, "It's Not Polite to Bite." By the time Lily was old enough to go to full-day kindergarten, she didn't have many friends. Her parents were kind of nervous sending her to school because of her biting issue, but they thought maybe Lily's teacher could figure out how to handle it better than they could. But they probably should have given her teacher a heads up about Lily when they dropped her off for school. When the teacher bent over to pick up the chalk, Lily took a chunk out of her rear end. So Lily got sent home early on her first day of kindergarten. And this was a big problem for her parents, because they both worked from home so they couldn't be watching her every second. They took her back to the pediatrician to see if there was anything she could do. The doctor ran some tests, and a few days later she called them in to share the results. It turns out the reason Lily liked biting things so much was because she was a vampire. And even though it was hard for Lily's parents to hear that, they were glad they finally had some answers. The doctor said the good news was that vampires aren't contagious until they're full grown, so right now the biting was more annoying than anything. Lily's parents didn't understand how their daughter was a vampire, since neither of them were vampires. But then Lily's mom remembered that when she was pregnant, she got bitten by a vampire bat, so that must have been how it happened. Lily's parents were happy to know what was going on with their daughter, But it still didn't solve their problem. They really needed her to be in school, but they couldn't send her if she was going to keep biting people. Lily's pediatrician said there was a special school where Lily could learn with other kids just like her. But even though the brochure looked nice, Lily's parents knew they could never afford to send her to a place like Transylvania, School for Biters. Lily's parents asked her pediatrician if there was anything else she could do for their daughter. So the doctor wrote a note to Lily's school explaining the situation. From the desk of Nisha Saad, M.D. Dear Principal Septian, Lily is a vampire, and vampires need to bite. Well, it turned out the school was great about it. They made all sorts of changes in the classroom, like putting the teacher in head-to-toe padded protective gear, and from then on, when Lily bit her teacher, it was really no big deal. They even made changes in the cafeteria, like adding blood-filled juice boxes next to the milk cartons, so Lily could feel included. Lily's classmates thought being a vampire was cool, so now everybody wanted to be her friend. And they all wanted to be just like her, so they started acting like her too. Of course, it was harder for the teacher to teach, with a bunch of kids clinging to her by their teeth. Things were going pretty great for Lily at school, and she had a ton of new friends. And now everyone wanted to come over for playdates. But then one day the pediatrician called and asked Lily's parents to come back into her office. She said she had read the test results wrong, and that Lily wasn't a vampire after all. She was just a bad kid who liked biting people. Well, you would think that Lily's parents would be thrilled to find out that their daughter wasn't a vampire. But Lily was doing great at school, and they really didn't want her home during the workday. So they decided to keep the test results to themselves. And when Lily had a birthday party and everyone in her class came, her parents felt like they'd made the right choice. Happy birthday, Lily! The Human Head. Everybody's heard the legend of the Headless Horseman who terrorized the town of Sleepy Hollow a long time ago. But I'll bet you've never heard the story of the Human Head, who lived a few miles away in the town of Elmsford. And just because the Human Head didn't go around chucking flaming jack-o'-lanterns at people doesn't mean his story isn't worth telling, too. So let's start at the beginning. Before the Human Head of Elmsford got his nickname, he was just a regular kid named Anders. Anders was normal in every way, except he was born without a body. But that didn't stop Anders from doing all the things other kids his age did, like jumping off a diving board, or, in Anders's case, bouncing his head off a diving board. Anders's parents loved him very much and told him he could be whatever he wanted to be, and that made Anders feel good. Anders had lots of friends in elementary school and was so popular that he got voted class president in the 5th grade. Vote for Anders, head and shoulders above the rest. But things changed when it came time for Anders to go to middle school. A few of his closest friends moved away during the summer, and some others went to private school. So when September came around, Anders felt like he was starting over. The first day of middle school isn't easy for anyone, but it's even harder when you're a late bloomer like Anders, and you haven't hit your growth spurt yet. Back in elementary school, Anders stayed in one classroom the whole day. But middle school was a different thing.